Hi, I'm Dr. Todd Cohen talking to you from NYIT in Old Westbury, New York. I am their chief of cardiology. I'm the director of medical device innovation, and I'm a professor here at New York Tech. And my whole life, I've been an inventor. And I want to just tell you my story in the beginning. And I first want to thank the people, the National Academy of Inventors. This is their ScholarShare, and I'm going to share my story and how I got my beginning as a wee one. I was always a tinkerer, and early on, I was always building things, playing things, very interested in mathematics and physics. And one of the first things that hit me when I was in high school was my grandfather had a pacemaker. And the pacemaker was just a simple device that just paced at a regular rate. And he wound up dying of a heart attack. And it was very painful for me to see this. Well, shortly thereafter, I got a chance while I was in college at Johns Hopkins to be in a summer program back in New Jersey at Newark Beth Israel Medical Center with Dr. Victor Parsonet, one of the first doctors to implant the modern day pacemaker called the transvenous pacemaker, which was inserted through a blood vessel. And most of the students, the college students back in the 70s who were with me, every one of them was doing chart reviews. I was fortunate because of me being a tinkerer, interested in electronics and devices. They threw me in a room to tackle the problem of devices, which was lead fracture. Now, these generators, pulse generators of devices had leads coming out of them, and the leads would break due to the wear and tear and the movement of the human body. And my job was to get rid of the lead altogether and create a leadless pacemaker. So I built one with a transmitter and a receiver. I actually built the circuitry myself, tested it in a saline bath, encapsulated it in silastic, and demonstrated that it worked non-invasively. But then Dr. Parsonet implanted it in a dog and demonstrated that it worked. And this was the first leadless pacemaker from the 1970s. Lo and behold, fast forward to around the year 2010, when leadless pacemakers finally got developed and approved, more like the size of a bullet without a transmitter and receiver. And now there's a device called the Micra and other devices that are out there which are there in technology. But my story back then, with my getting interested in pacemakers and cardiology, even early on, I was very focused before there was even a electrophysiology field or society. And at that point in time, I got to see a medical student from New Jersey who had a pacemaker. And I remember him grabbing the programmer and saying, listen, I got to take this programmer up on the mountain because when I ski, I got to increase the heart rate and it doesn't do it automatically. So I thought to myself, well, maybe there's a feedback system or something I can develop, some sensor that we can put into the body that can determine the need to increase heart rate. And I went to the university at Johns Hopkins, and I told them about this idea, and I started doing a lot of independent study on it, and I had the concept for this rate responsive pacemaker idea before it even became a term. And they approached all the big pacemaker companies. They were all interested in the concept. I was doing the research on my own and eventually hooked up with a medical school at Johns Hopkins who was also interested in this. And when my non-disclosure agreements expired, one of the companies basically filed the patent based on exactly the idea that I disclosed upon them. I had no recourse. But fortunately, I was young, I was innovative, and I had a lot of energy and perseverance. And I also saw the development of the next generation device, the implantable defibrillator, a bigger, more powerful device that could treat sudden death. But its problem was it couldn't distinguish insignificant from significant arrhythmias. So I started saying maybe those same sensors that I was investigating for pacemakers could be applied to these devices, help with arrhythmia discrimination. And I was fortunate enough during my residency to do it at one of the Johns Hopkins Community Hospitals, Sinai Hospital of Baltimore, and work with the inventor of the implantable defibrillator, Dr. Morty Mower, one of the inventors and in the original animal lab. And he allowed me to do studies that demonstrated these principles. And I demonstrated that these sensors and these algorithms that I would develop would work in an animal model. So I went to Morty and I said, Morty, listen, thank you for being my mentor. I know you've gotten some patents. Do you think we should patent this? He goes, you definitely should patent this. I said, well, why? Can you help me? What should we do? And he said, well, no, this should be your thing. And he said, well, do you have anybody you'd recommend for a patent attorney? I knew he had a patent attorney because he's a smart guy. And he said, no, just go to the phone book, look up patent attorney. So I did what he said. I opened the phone book. I looked alphabetically. I looked at A, there's no A's. I saw B, Leonard Bloom, law offices of Leonard Bloom, Towson, Maryland, right next door to Baltimore, where I was. Called him up, told him the story. He loved it. He was a Johns Hopkins alum, and he said, hey, let me think about this. He thought about it. And he said, I'll take you on as a contingency client. I know you're a starting undergrad student, not undergrad student, but resident. And, just I'll work things out. So if this ever becomes anything, I'll just take a piece of it, but you don't have to lay out any money. So for many, many years, I would do research in animals, initially at Sinai Hospital of Baltimore. And then eventually, when I did my cardiology training at Stanford, I was doing human studies at that point in time on the same type of sensors that I was looking at in animals for arrhythmia discrimination. And I would prove the stuff, develop the algorithms, and he would file the patent and get me the patent. Long and short of it is, I had a few patents, maybe had 4 or 5 patents by the time I was at Stanford. And there was an up and coming Silicon Valley company called Inventors, and they were very interested in this. And at one point, they offered me equity in the company. He said, we weren't really interested in equity. And then a bigger pacemaker company, not a startup, Siemens Pacesetter Systems, was interested in the whole portfolio. We flew down to Sylmar, Southern California. They loved the stuff. They made me an offer, which to me seemed like a lot of money, and I was more money than I had ever seen before. And we celebrated with the president of the company. I got back to the Bay Area at Stanford, and they said, no, we can't go through with the deal. We think we see some prior art on this. So nothing happened. So Len and I went back to the drawing board and came up with a different strategy. Our strategy was simple. We're going to non-exclusively license these companies. If they like this stuff, they can ride along with us, and they all have the opportunity to have this intellectual property. So we licensed Medtronic, Intermedics, Siemens Pacesetter Systems, and Guidant. And for many, many years, they were paying me a minimal annual royalty, and they had no products. None until Medtronic developed a heart failure treatment product, sensing product that was in their biventricular devices called the Optival. And that, when they came out with that device, I saw that I had claims specifically for detecting heart failure based on transthoracic impedance, based on the principles that they were using, which was comparison of a short-term to a long-term mean. And we went to Medtronic, and at that point in time, they said, we're not so sure. Really, we need to pay any royalties based on this product now that you have this. And so I said to Len, what do we do? He said, we got to get a good opinion. So we went to a big firm that does this kind of analysis, that looked at my 17 patents, my 1,000+ claims, and the new invention and how it worked, and came up with a encyclopedia about yay thick of basically an analysis of their device and my patents. It basically showed that they clearly were using my intellectual property. When it showed it to Medtronic, and they basically said, we think you're right. We want to sit down with you, and we'd like to buy your license agreements and your 17 patents. And so we negotiated an agreement in the Olympic Towers in Manhattan, and they wound up buying my patents. And the long and short of it is this same sensor is now available in almost every implantable defibrillator device for detecting heart failure. And many, many people have benefited from this technology. So the story was one over 30 years. This was not a quick story. Most of my stories are long stories, and they're based on the same principles. And I'm going to tell you about the principles on the next part of my series, where I'm going to discuss the ISIS principle, which is based on idea, science, inexpensive, and simple. So take a deep breath and smile, because you too can be an inventor. Len and I went back and thought about this and said, you know what, we're going to get a second opinion. Went to an outside patent firm to investigate my patents, my 1,000 claims in my patents, and the new product of Medtronic, and they came up with this compendium of an encyclopedia about yay big of an analysis that basically said, yes, they're directly using my patents. We gave this information to Medtronic, and they basically said, let's talk. We met in a very nice mentor of mine's apartment overlooking Central Park with a high ups at Medtronic, and started talking about this, and they wanted to buy my 17 patents, and they wanted to buy my 4 non-exclusive licenses for related to these sensors in devices. And they did. And this is a long story, and I'm going to take you into some of the principles that I can take home from this. So I'm going to go to my computer and show you this, and we're going to begin by showing you just some of my licenses and acquisitions from a myriad of companies. We talked a little bit about how I began in the pacemaker, defibrillator, implantable heart device field, and how that became successful and involved pretty much every company that puts sensors for detecting heart failure in the devices. And we're going to now talk and go from this concept to a CPR device. We're going to reflect on the principles that I use and give an example related to robotics and cardiac catheter ablation. So to begin with, I've had a number of big devices, at least a dozen that have gone from concept to bedside. And they all follow the same type of principles. They all describe some kind of idea that is based on pain that I personally experienced, whether it be the death of my grandfather with the first one, or the death or the life-saving procedure for another one, which has to do with the CPR device, or the pain that I felt from wearing lead for electrophysiology procedures that led me into developing a simple robotic system for treating catheter ablation. So with the CPR device, I was again in training at the University of California, San Francisco. And my dear fellow trainee, Keith Laurie, had just published an article in JAMA, and the title of the article was more like a letter, and it was CPR. The P stands for plumber's helper. And it was about an Iranian family where somebody died in the family and didn't know what to do, and they grabbed the toilet plunger and they started plunging the chest, and it became like a big joke. Jay Leno did this whole thing on the Tonight Show opening of this plunging of the chest. There were cartoons about it, all kinds of crazy things. I think there might have even been a sketch on Saturday Night Live related to this. And I went to Keith and said, "Look, everybody's laughing, but maybe you have something here. You mind if I take some of these ideas and test them in an animal model?" So we tested the idea of a plunger-like device and compared it to manual CPR, first in animals, and then created a working group where we started tackling cardiac arrest. And this working group would go to San Francisco General and University of California, San Francisco. And we put ourselves on call 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, responding to cardiac arrest. And we would be checking and comparing manual CPR to this, what we called active compression, decompression CPR. The active compression is what standard CPR does, but the active decompression is pressing and pulling up on the chest and actively sucking up on the chest. And lo and behold, we demonstrated that both in animals and humans that we can improve cardiac circulation. And we eventually published an article in JAMA and eventually did a randomized study that was published in the New England Journal. And we a bunch of centers at the time, after I was at UCSF at the time, I was at North Shore Manhasset in Long Island as when I was running their electrophysiology program. We were doing this randomized trial, and everything was going well. And there was another one happening in St. Paul, Minnesota, under Dr. Laurie's mentorship, and a third possibly in the Bay Area. And these were all stopped by FDA because the question was, these patients who collapsed, the IRBs all waived informed consent because the patients were not awake, couldn't sign informed consent, and they believed they needed to give informed consent. So resuscitation research for a long period of time was stopped, and there were debates and hearings related to this. And eventually they agreed that, yeah, you can waive informed consent, but there needs to be some public information related to this. So the CPR device that we developed was at UCSF was pretty much immediately licensed by Ambu, which made a device that I have here that I'm holding in my hands. This is the first commercial version of the device, which was released and sold worldwide, not approved in the US because the FDA did stop the trial. And it was called the cardio pump, became very popular. Politicians used it to attack the FDA. There were articles in Time Magazine and Newsday and Newsweek, New York Times, you name it, and even TV shows on this. And I have pictures of Hillary Clinton and Newt Gingrich, again, attacking FDA for not approving this device. Well, why would they attack FDA for not approving a device? Well, the problem is that standard CPR is not that effective, and we needed a better mousetrap, and this provided the better mousetrap. Long and short of it is, Dr. Laurie formed a company, got the rights to it. The company was called Advanced Circulatory, demonstrated in a more complete randomized clinical trial that this device was more effective than standard CPR, published an article in Lancet, and eventually the device was approved by the FDA and eventually incorporated in devices, not only by his company, Advanced Circulatory, which was sold to Zoll Medical pretty much as soon as the device was approved, and also incorporated in a automatic mechanical device known as the Lucas 3 CPR device. And those two devices are used commercially today and used worldwide in the US and abroad. So that brings me to another principle that is, well, what is my method? How does this work? How did I get success? Well, I go back in history, beyond the history of our country, our great country in the United States. back to the time of the Egyptians, where here we see a goddess known as Isis. And Isis was not a terrorist at the time. It was an Egyptian goddess who was known as the motherhood and the magic, or the mother of invention or innovation. And I use the mnemonic of Isis for idea, science, inexpensive, and simple. Well, my ideas come out of pain. And for the third example, which will be the robotic ablation system I developed called the Amigo, the pain I felt was pain of wearing lead and being exposed to radiation and hurting my back and going through physical therapy. You saw that the pain of the loss of life of my grandfather led me down the pathway of pacemaker and defibrillator innovation. The loss of life also led me down the pathway of working on CPR devices. And of course, these ideas need to be grounded in science. But I also had a practical method. And my method, unlike many types of inventions, for me, did not require a lot of money. They were very inexpensive when I developed them. I told you about those 17 patents that I didn't pay a dime, essentially almost didn't pay a dime for, that wound up with 4 non-exclusive licenses and eventually a big acquisition of the 17 patents. But this inexpensive approach is a good approach, because what I can do is I could find an unmet need. And then when I have that unmet need, I can develop a prototype based on science. I can protect the intellectual property inexpensively for just a couple $100 with a provisional patent, and get somebody interested in picking up the expense based on what I prove. And my concepts in general have been very, very simple in their approach. We talked about the pain of that unmet need, and the magic is the passion and the perseverance. I call myself, again, I'm going back to the pyramids of Giza, and we can build upon the principles uh, like a pyramid, really. And we build upon those principles with the pain, the passion, and the perseverance. And I've come up with what I call an easy approach. It has to have a regulatory pathway to getting approved, a successful pathway. They have to be somewhat simple and inexpensive, and usually to the point that I can even build the prototype myself, or with assistance from other students and members of my team. I build the intellectual property usually in an inexpensive way, not the expensive way by paying for these expensive patents. And again, they're grounded in science, like I told you. Even the manufacturing OEM principles that I use for creating better prototypes, the bidding pathway led to an inexpensive approach to getting inexpensive prototypes. Again, we go into the commercialization, which is marketing and branding. And even the term easy I've used in some of my inventions. One that's used today, and that one is called the easy holder. Again, sales can be easy, and the license and acquisition approach can be an easy pitch. So let's talk about robotics and how that came about, and show you how I applied that principle. Well, here is one of the nurses that worked in our lab, and she may be smiling, but you see she's wearing 20 pounds of lead. And after 3 hours of wearing the lead during an electrophysiology procedure, you need the lead to protect yourself from the radiation. Well, she wasn't smiling after 3 hours, and I wasn't either. My back was killing me. Lots of physical therapy. So I had to find a simple approach. Well, there were complicated approaches, big, expensive machines that would cost $1 million or more big platforms such as that by Stereotaxis and Hanson Medical. And so I wound up saying, well, maybe there's a way I can use the tried and true catheters and sheaths that I use during standard EP studies and just figure out a way that I can manipulate them remotely. Well, the first system I wound up going to where I currently am a professor at New York Tech. And I actually wound up coming here and looking for an engineering student to partner with, and there were no takers. And so I had to reach out to another engineering school not far from me called Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, RPI. And I got an engineering student, Michael Eilenberg, who wound up was interested. He did some CAD/CAM drawings. And eventually I went to him and said, listen, can you build me a prototype that worked, that can demonstrate that I can take a standard ablation catheter, put it in the machine, operate it from 20 feet away, and demonstrate that I can the proof of concept with this. And he built this thing, kind of a Lego erector set version of a robotic system, and it was built by his fraternity. I went up in my minivan, picked it up from his frat up in near Albany, where Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute is, and brought it back. And eventually, I had a showcase at my national meeting at Heart Rhythm, where I took out a suite. I said invitations to the big companies, see how Cardiac Inventions does the robot. I use Robbie the robot from Forbidden Planet, and I have invited the bigwigs from all these electrophysiology ablation companies to come see it. Well, they were all interested, including the Boston Scientific, which before I even showed it at the meeting said, hey, we want to license this. And they wanted to give me a license. And well, I went forth in the meeting. I had people come. I did my dog and pony show and demonstrated how this worked. And there was a guy on my floor who was a venture capital guy. And I had just sold my patents for 17 with sold my over 17 patents to Medtronic and the license agreements. And I said, well, maybe I won't do a license agreement here. Maybe I will do a startup. And so gentlemen on the floor formed a company called Catheter Robotics. And I was one of the vice presidents of the company. And very quickly, we enhanced the intellectual property. We developed a working prototype, which we tested in animals. I tested in animals. And eventually, this device became the Amigo. And the Amigo was a device that was cleared for use. And I used it in New York for ablation. And here's the device that I used on many cases. For those who are interested, you can read about my experience with the Amigo and how I used it without wearing lead, just sitting in the control room using a simple handheld controller. And this shows a standard catheter that is basically driven into the human body and controlled remotely. And this is the system that we used, known as the Amigo. Again, very simple, relatively inexpensive to those other systems, grounded in science, based on the idea of pain. The last invention I'm going to talk about is something very easy. So when we do electrophysiology or interventional cardiology procedures, they're often complicated procedures and need multiple people to hold multiple things. Well, in EP, you often need somebody to hold a catheter, hold this thing in place, or you're putting a stent in, you have to have somebody hold the guide wire while you're deploying the stent or holding and releasing something. And the Easy Holder is a device that literally is very inexpensive, very comes in packets, is patented, and can hold 3 devices simultaneously, and it's a disposable sterile device. Again, using my principles and just show you, the idea was the fact that multiple people, the guy next door might be exposed to potentially getting stuck if I hit him with a needle. and perhaps I can hold all these catheters and things in place. And I worked with creating some prototypes myself, and I eventually worked with a company that did it just for bidding. They just did the work and created a prototype, and eventually partnered with this company called TZ Medical, which created the device you see here. And you see a complicated AFib ablation in which we're holding multiple catheters in place in the groin. It's basically a peel-off double-sided tape with a novel design that can hold a whole range of sizes and shapes of catheters and wires that go into the human body in place. And so we need less staff when we do these procedures. Again, here it is during a hands-free ablation. So I could be doing an ablation or an EP study. It can keep the catheters in place, and I can operate the radio frequency generator or the pulse field ablation generator, or any generator for that matter, without, with my hands not holding the catheters and sheaths in place. And many times during an EP study, patients are shocked, and these things move right out of the body. And we have demonstrated that the catheters are all kept in place with this type of device. So again, going through the easy pathway to commercialization, pain creates the idea, passion and perseverance creates the prototype based on science. This device was inexpensive. Perseverance as we build up the IP. We tested and proved that it works. The regulatory approval for this device, which was a 510(k), was very, very easy. And marketing's been easy, and it's been sold and used all over the place. So to quote the Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. Here's an example of the same device used in which one person can hold a catheter in place and catheters in place while sheaths are slit during a biventricular device implantation where 3 leads are placed in one another, and the leads are often dislodged, and these little devices can prevent another individual from coming in, and it can hold the catheters in place while I slit the sheath and release the lead and suture it in place. So we've demonstrated an easy way based on the Cohen ISIS principles to be helpful during all EP and ablation procedures. It's also useful during interventional cardiology. And, so now I want to kind of conclude and just tell you that you don't need to spend a lot of money to be an innovator. You don't need to have big investors to necessarily be successful. And I'm living proof of that. And it's due to my passion, my own perseverance, that have been able to relieve some of the pain that I've seen and witnessed based on my own family members, my own self in the pain of wearing lead, and the pain of seeing people suffer from unsuccessful cardiac resuscitation. And so thank you for listening to my story. Thank you to the National Academy of Inventors, and I hope you enjoy my story. I'm Dr. Todd Cohen, signing off.